when you look at the skills and I guess the leadership sort of technique or style that works at this extreme environment where you're essentially leading as if your life depends upon it, I mean, why wouldn't, I guess, you want to bring those attributes into a more normal workplace where there's not those dangers, but you have team members who are following you as if their life depends upon it.
Patrick, great to talk to you. You're in a very different position from a lot of the leaders we've spoken to. You know, you're not necessarily doing it in the office all day and leading the troops. You're leading people up the top of mountains, and dangerous mountains at that. How different is that, do you think?
In some regards, I think it's quite different because there's obviously a significant threat of life, and that's maybe not something you're encountering in your office environment. But in another regard, I guess it's actually quite similar. I think that the issues you deal with leading people in an extreme environment versus in not such an extreme environment, you can certainly learn a lot from that extreme environment. So, you know, lessons from the edge, I guess, I think you can apply to everyday business.
When you are under those challenges, you know, as you say, their lives often depend on someone who is leading them. They have to have total trust in you. What other sort of attributes do they look for in you?
I think it's a combination of, as you said, trust. I think believing the sincerity of the leader and believing in their competence, their own experience, so that leader can effectively and safely guide them through what is or what can be a fairly dangerous circumstance and ultimately achieve whatever the goal is, and in most cases on a mountaineering expedition it's obviously reaching the summit and getting back down safely.
In a corporate setting, people have a lot of time to get to know their staff and what makes them tick and what makes them excel and that sort of thing. When you're doing an expedition, you have to get to know people very quickly and they have to get to know you very quickly. So how do you build that rapport?
Yeah, well, it's a little different to the corporate sector, I guess. Not only it's less time, but it also is very, very compressed, because if your average expedition is, say, 30 days up to, on Everest, it might be 60 days, you actually do spend quite a lot of time with one another, living in each other's sort of space, and often going through some fairly harrowing and intense experiences. So you do get to know your teammates fairly well in that regard. But it certainly can prove tricky at the outset if you're leading an expedition, and if you have new team members who you're not particularly familiar with. Very quickly you're trying to assess what their motivations are for being there, and that is particularly important, I think, to determine what their motivations are, because then it's easier to I guess to not only motivate them, but also just to predict how they're going to react to an environment which is often changing.
Your life can depend on their behaviour as well. That's the thing, you're caught in this together, aren't you?
Absolutely, absolutely. And when I started out mountaineering, when I was essentially just learning the ropes, so to speak, myself, and probably the easiest way for somebody to learn the ropes in the Himalayas is to join commercial expeditions. And so this was in the early days when I used to sign up for expeditions where I'd meet team members in Kathmandu or in Islamabad in Pakistan or whatever for the first time, and you're going to be tied into a rope with them. And very quickly I realised that was really not my preference, because I felt that was taking on too big a risk. So that's when I sort of morphed into basically just doing my own climbing and establishing a good working relationship with a number of Sherpa friends of mine, and that's a much sort of safer way, because your lives do depend upon one another, and if you're tied into that rope, you want to be sure that they're as competent as you, and hopefully even more competent than you.
Yeah, there's whole challenges. You're having to make decisions based on the conditions and that sort of thing. Where does the element of a good leader come into that? Because you're having to rely upon external factors, not necessarily your ability as a leader. Or am I wrong?
Yeah, I certainly think that the leader needs to be fairly good at reading the environment, so really outward looking rather than being introspective. I think that, and certainly I've found that times when I've been quite scared in the mountains, I'm actually quite scared of heights, so that's been a bit of an impediment for my mountaineering career. But I guess having the ability to try and look outwardly and really focus on the environment, to try and ascertain what's changing, is the best way to control your own feelings as well. And I think a leader who also leads other people in those sort of changing circumstances, I think that if that leader can be innovative and adaptive, and that's going to help the whole team get through circumstances which are not entirely predictable.
Give me some examples of where it's been challenging, you know, based on where you've been, the conditions you've been under, maybe the nature of some of them struggling with injuries or whatever it might be.
Sure. A couple of different examples. In 2009, I was on a mountain called Barunse, which is a 7,200 metre peak in the Nepali Himalaya, not far from Everest. And we got to an altitude of about 6,900 metres. This was on our summit push. So we're only about 3 or 4 hours climbing away from the actual summit, about 300 vertical metres below the top. But we came to a very steep snow slope, which was very loosely, it wasn't consolidated snow, it snowed overnight. And we had a 2,000 metre drop down to our left, and the summit wasn't far, but we had to cross this slope, and a 2,000 metre drop straight down on our left-hand side. Every time we tried to cross that snow slope, the snow would actually give way beneath our feet. And a difficult decision because you're physically exhausted. It's the end of a month-long expedition. You've invested a huge amount of energy and finances into getting to the top, and to get so close, but then to be forced with this conundrum, so to speak. But in the end, it was actually pretty straightforward because we realised, well, the risk of that snow slope actually avalanching and taking us 2,000 metres straight down was too great. And we thought, well, we're close enough to the summit, and that'll do for today. So that's certainly an example of where we had to, I guess, make some fairly sensible and strong decisions when it would be tempting to possibly just push it a little bit further. But I have had friends who have made calls like that and has been fortunate and who've passed away in the mountains. So that sort of certainly hits home when you see that happening. That's one good example. A different example was just more recently, only a few months ago. I was leading an expedition to Ama Dablam, which is a 6,800 metre mountain just down the valley from Everest, and it's a very steep and quite imposing and technically challenging mountain. And I wasn't probably as fit as I should have been for that role of leading this group of 4 climbers, and I was really actually quite overwhelmed by fear, and I struggled to internalise that. Having only recently found out that I was to become a father for the first time, and I found that to be incredibly confronting, and I really questioned what was I actually doing on this mountain. If I was there just on my own expedition, I would have turned around and left, but I felt that I had an obligation to the team, that I was there to help them get up the mountain. That was my first task.
How did you make sure that they didn't see the fear?
Well, look, at times they probably did see the fear, and that's something I really only realised afterwards. I think that it really is particularly important to control that.
How did it affect them, do you think?
Look, I mean, I don't know if it significantly affected them, but just at times I remember thinking, I shouldn't have said that, or I shouldn't have done that, because that just may, I guess, undermine some confidence that they have in me. So really, what I actually did was an interesting way. In my own tent in the evenings, I'd pull out my video camera and I'd sort of have a video diary, record my thoughts. That was a way that I could actually get those feelings out onto camera, and essentially recognise those feelings of fear, and then decide, they're there, but I'm really just going to have to deal with them in a week's time whenever we're off the mountain. And then once I'm back in base camp, that's when I'll properly be able to sort of process that fear. And that was ultimately what I did. And we got 3 of the 4 clients up onto the summit, and we had a fantastic expedition, and I think everybody really enjoyed it as well.
Did you learn a lot yourself as a result of going through that? And people often say, leadership is all about experiences, some good, some bad. How's that changed you?
Yeah, look, a huge amount, and for me, my entire mountaineering career, sort of 15 years long, has been one of constant learning and experiential learning, I guess. I've pretty much made every mistake you can make in the book in mountaineering. I've suffered high altitude illness before, pulmonary edema, where I've almost been killed in 2006. That was actually on Ama Dablam, so it was 6 years later that I was able to return and actually successfully climb that mountain. But it's only through learning through all those mistakes that I've made that I've really gained a huge respect for the Himalayas, and I guess in particular the dangers of extreme altitude. We were on our summit push on Everest. We were caught in a traffic jam at about 8,600 metres, just below the south summit of Everest. So the level of oxygen up that high is about a quarter of what's available at sea level. And at the front of this queue of climbers, there are about 40 climbers in this large expedition, and I was just there with my Sherpa mates. We ran into the back of them, and for 2 hours we couldn't move. Nobody was moving, and the guy at the front of this queue couldn't get up this rock and ice, and people were incredibly complacent, and I was the lone sort of Aussie reckless climber yelling and swearing at people to get out of the way because they were all going to die if they weren't too careful. And that was quite alarming to see that complacency. And I think that probably is through lack of experience and respect.
But that was strong leadership. That was experience telling you had to do something because it was dangerous.
Yeah, I guess so. And I mean, I'd been on another 8,000 metre mountain only half a year earlier, and that was when I'd really learnt to respect that 8,000 metres in particular and above is a very, very dangerous environment, and there's very little room for error. And I certainly felt that we didn't have any time to waste. Once you're above 8,000 metres, you really can't. Your minutes are ticking by. I mean, the human body can't survive for long up there.
I want to explore that idea of how you can take your experiences from up in the mountain to bring it into a corporate sector, and how you can work with leaders and others to better the way that they perform. How does that work?
I guess it's built on the premise that in this sort of extreme environment, at the edge, leaders need to be adaptive and innovative. And that it's when you look at the skills and I guess the leadership sort of technique or style that works at this extreme environment, where you're essentially leading as if your life depends upon it. I mean, why wouldn't, I guess, you want to bring those attributes into a more normal workplace where there's not those dangers, but you have team members who are following you as if their life depends upon it? Because when your life depends upon somebody else, I guess you believe in what they're doing. They are protecting your life, and the outcomes can be fairly great, I think. My experience, and in some of the team building sort of workshops that I've run in the Stirling Ranges in the southwest of the state, and also in other areas, I've seen certainly you take the individual outside of the comfort zone, and it's really, really confronting. And at the time, nobody really likes being outside of their comfort zone, and I don't really like it either. But afterwards, once you've passed through that process and you then reflect back on what you actually learnt in that extreme environment, I think the capacity to learn and the capacity to see how team members interact with one another, I think the capacity for learning is quite significant.
Interesting in the conversations we've had in this space with some big leaders, that they've all benefited from having some difficult experiences, some sort of life-changing experience where their decision-making at the time was going to have profound impact.
Yeah. Is
that the same sort of thing here, that when you put people under that physical extreme, they're going to naturally be changed as a result of that?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's the author, a great author on leadership, Warren Bennis, in his book Learning to Lead, he talks about some of the greatest leaders of the world having been through crucibles in their lives, significantly difficult periods of life that they've had to come through, sort of almost like the steel being forged in the fire, so to speak. And that the really good leadership sort of capacity comes out of that. And whilst in some of the exercises I might be trying to run, I'm not trying to put people through such an extreme extent. I think that the general theory still applies that through, I guess, negotiating adverse conditions, we can certainly learn a lot about ourselves as individuals. We can learn a lot about our teammates. And I think for a good leader, I think you've got to be self-aware. I think self-awareness is a really important trait of a good leader, and also being aware of your teammates. And so I think that we can learn from those experiences.
And if there was going to be one thing that people remember you for, what would it be?
One thing that I was remembered for, look, I guess it would be, I'm going to say a few things. Essentially being a good person, a good partner, a family member, father, and a friend, somebody with a big heart who embraced life with a passion.
It's pretty good to be remembered for.
Yeah.
Nice to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much.